Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The Secret Buried in the Backyard. Scary story published by Scray Fiction. Read for you by Scray Fiction. Chapter 1. Unearthing the Past. The house stood at the end of Willow Lane, its worn bricks and sagging roof a testament to the years it had weathered. Emily Harper hadn't set foot inside since she was 12, the day her father vanished without a trace. Now, 2 decades later, she found herself standing at the threshold once more, clutching the tarnished key her mother had kept hidden in a dusty drawer until her death. The scent of old wood and decay greeted her as she pushed the door open, stepping into the dim hallway. The walls were lined with faded photographs of a family that once was, and Emily felt the familiar ache in her chest, the same hollow emptiness that had followed her since childhood. She wandered through the house, her footsteps echoing off the hardwood floors, each creak a whisper of memories she had tried to bury. The living room, with its outdated furniture and dust-covered mantel, felt like a shrine to a past she no longer recognized. Yet, it was the backyard that drew her in. The tall grass swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, but beneath its innocent dance, Emily sensed something was wrong. She remembered playing there as a child, her father's laughter echoing as they chased each other around the oak tree. But now, the yard felt different, darker, heavier. Picking up an old rusted spade from the shed, Emily began clearing the overgrown weeds, her movements fueled by a restless energy she couldn't explain. It wasn't long before the spade struck something hard. Her heart pounded as she knelt down, brushing away the dirt to reveal the edges of a small, unmarked grave. The sight of it sent a chill down her spine, and for a moment she hesitated, fear clawing at the edges of her mind. Just then, Mrs. Henderson appeared at the fence, her eyes narrow with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Best leave that alone, dear," she said, her voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. "Some things are meant to stay buried." But Emily couldn't walk away, not now. The grave seemed to call to her, a whisper from the past that she couldn't ignore. Ignoring Mrs. Henderson's warning, Emily continued to dig, determined to uncover whatever secrets the earth held. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Emily unearthed more than just soil. She uncovered a piece of her past, one that would not rest until the truth was finally brought to light. Chapter 2. The Whispering Shadows. As darkness settled over Willow Lane, Emily stood in the backyard, her breath visible in the sudden chill that clung to the night air. The small, unmarked grave lay before her, its contents still unknown, but stirring something deep within her. She shivered, not just from the cold, but from a creeping unease that had begun to seep into her bones. The faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of cicadas did little to mask the silence that seemed to engulf the yard. With a final glance at the disturbed earth, Emily retreated into the house, bolting the door behind her. Inside, the house was colder than before, the kind of cold that didn't just touch your skin, but settled deep into your soul. Emily rubbed her arms, trying to shake off the sense of dread that clung to her like a second skin. She tried to distract herself, to push away the gnawing questions and the image of that grave, but her mind refused to cooperate. Every creak of the old house, every flicker of the lights, felt like a warning, a prelude to something sinister lurking just out of sight. That night, sleep came fitfully, if at all. Emily tossed and turned, the thin blanket offering no comfort against the icy air. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were twisted and dark. She was a child again, running through the backyard, her father's voice calling out to her. But his tone wasn't playful. It was desperate, filled with fear. The whispers followed her, growing louder with every step, until they became a cacophony of voices, all demanding to be heard. She woke with a start, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding against her ribs. But the whispers didn't fade. They lingered, soft but insistent, as if someone or something was just beyond her door. Days blurred into nights, and the once welcoming town began to feel like a prison. The cheerful facades of the houses, the manicured lawns, all seemed to hide something rotten beneath. The neighbors, once friendly, now regarded Emily with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Even Jack, her childhood friend who had stayed in town while she had moved away, seemed different. He visited often, always with a concerned smile and a gentle nudge to take a break, to let go of the past. But Emily couldn't. The whispers, the cold spots that appeared in random corners of the house, and the nightmares that followed her day and night had her in their grip. It was during one of these restless nights that Emily found herself drawn to the attic, a place she hadn't dared to visit since she returned. The old wooden steps groaned under her weight as she climbed, a flashlight in hand, its weak beam cutting through the thick dust that hung in the air. In the far corner, beneath a moth-eaten blanket, she discovered a box. Inside, faded family photos showed her parents smiling, a normal family until the last few, where her father's expression grew distant, haunted. And then there were the documents, yellowed with age, that hinted at something darker, something he had been running from or toward. As she sifted through the remnants of her past, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to be coming from all around her, pressing in on her until she could barely breathe. The house, the town, her own memories, they were all closing in, trapping her in a web of secrets and lies. And at the center of it all was the grave in the backyard, a silent promise of more horrors to come. Chapter 3: Unveiling the Truth. The attic's suffocating air pressed down on Emily as she clutched the yellowed documents and the photos of her parents. Her father's haunted eyes stared back at her, and for the first time, she could see the fear he'd tried so hard to hide. The whispers in the house grew louder, circling around her like vultures waiting to feast on her fear. But it wasn't just fear anymore. It was something more primal, a need to unearth the truth, no matter how horrifying it might be. Her thoughts drifted back to the small, unmarked grave in the backyard, now more than just an ominous presence. It was a question that demanded an answer. Without a second thought, Emily grabbed the flashlight and headed outside, the chill of the night air doing little to cool the fire of determination that now burned within her. The ground where she had first discovered the grave was still disturbed, the soil loose and dark against the moonlight. She fell to her knees, her hands trembling as she began to dig again. Every shovelful of earth that she moved felt like another layer of her past being peeled back, revealing something raw and bleeding underneath. The whispers in the night seemed to grow louder, almost frantic, but Emily couldn't stop now. She had to know what lay beneath. After what felt like an eternity, her spade struck something solid. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. With shaking hands, she cleared away the remaining dirt, revealing a small, weathered wooden box. The sight of it sent a shiver down her spine. Slowly, she pried it open, and inside, nestled in decaying fabric, were the fragile bones of a child and a rusted locket. The sight of the tiny skeleton was both heartbreaking and horrifying, a vision of innocence lost. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she picked up the locket, its metal cold against her skin. She opened it with trembling fingers, revealing a faded photo inside a picture of her mother as a young woman, smiling warmly. The other side of the locket held a lock of hair, dark and brittle with age. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This child had been buried here by someone she loved. But who? And why? As if in answer, A flash of memory assaulted her. She was a little girl again, standing at the window of her childhood bedroom. She could see her father in the backyard, his figure obscured by the darkness of night. He was digging, his movements frantic, desperate. She remembered the sound of his sobs, the way he'd whispered to himself, "It has to end here." The memory was vivid, more real than anything she had recalled before, and it left her reeling. Just then, a voice broke through the fog of her thoughts. "You shouldn't have done that," came Mrs. Henderson's quivering tone from the edge of the yard. Emily turned to see her neighbor standing there, her face pale in the moonlight, eyes wide with fear. "You knew," Emily accused, her voice barely more than a whisper. Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly, wringing her hands. "I did, but I was too scared to speak of it. There's a curse, Emily, a curse tied to your family. That grave. It was meant to keep it at bay. But now," she trailed off, her eyes darting around as if shadows themselves were watching. Emily's mind raced. The locket, the bones, the curse, everything pointed to a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. But as the house seemed to groan and shift behind her, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever had been buried here wasn't just a secret. It was something far more malevolent, and it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her. Determined to uncover the full extent of the horror that had plagued her family, Emily knew she couldn't stop now. She had to dig deeper into the past and into her own mind to find the answers before it was too late. Chapter 4. The Haunting Begins. The atmosphere inside the house had shifted, growing thick with a palpable tension that made the air feel heavy and oppressive. Emily could no longer ignore the unnatural cold that seemed to seep from the very walls, nor the shadows that twisted and stretched beyond what the dim light should have allowed. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows felt like a taunt, as if the house itself was mocking her attempts to unravel its secrets. The locket and the bones she had unearthed had been reburied in the backyard, but the sinister energy had only intensified. That night, as Emily lay in bed, sleep refused to come. The darkness of the room pressed in around her, thick and suffocating. Just as her eyes began to close, a soft, almost playful voice broke through the silence, a child's voice, whispering her name. Emily's eyes snapped open, her heart racing. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, like a breeze carrying a distant echo. She sat up, straining to hear, but the voice was gone, leaving only the relentless pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. The next morning, the house was eerily silent, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She moved through the rooms, her nerves frayed and her senses on high alert. As she reached the kitchen, the cupboard suddenly burst open with a loud crash, dishes flying off the shelves and shattering on the floor. Emily jumped back, her breath catching in her throat. Before she could react, the door to the basement slammed shut on its own, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. Fear clawed at her, but it was quickly replaced by a rising tide of anger. This was her home, and whatever was trying to drive her out would not succeed. She had to find out what had happened here, and she knew, deep down, that the answer was tied to her father's disappearance. But as her obsession deepened, so did the house's torment. It was as if the more she uncovered, the more the house fought back. Jack arrived that afternoon, his concern for Emily written all over his face. "Emily, this has to stop," he pleaded, standing in the doorway, his voice thick with worry. "This place, it's not safe. You're not safe." But Emily couldn't hear him, not really. Her mind was too caught up in the whirlwind of memories, whispers, and shadows that now consumed her every thought. "I can't leave, Jack," she said, her voice distant, eyes fixed on the floor as if searching for something hidden beneath the tiles. "There's more to this. Something terrible happened here, and I need to know what it was. Jack stepped closer, his frustration bubbling over. Emily, listen to yourself. You're not thinking straight. Whatever you think you're going to find, it's not worth losing yourself over. You need to get out of here before it's too late. Emily's gaze snapped up to meet his, her eyes wild with a mix of fear and determination. I am not leaving. I need to understand what happened to my father. I need to know why he disappeared. Don't you see? It's all connected, the grave, the house, everything. If I leave now, I'll never know the truth. Jack's shoulders slumped, his hands balling into fists at his sides. You're obsessed, Emily. This place is driving you mad. I can't stand by and watch you destroy yourself. But Emily was too far gone, her need for answers outweighing any concern for her own well-being. I have to do this, Jack. I'm sorry, but I have to stay. Jack shook his head, the pain of her words cutting deep. Then you're on your own, he said, his voice breaking with emotion. Without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving Emily alone with the malevolent force that now ruled her life. As the door closed behind him, the house seemed to sigh, a low, ominous groan that reverberated through the walls, sealing Emily's fate. Chapter 5. Dark Revelation. The oppressive atmosphere of the house had grown almost unbearable by the time Emily stumbled upon the old, weathered journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the attic. The book was small, bound in cracked leather, and smelled faintly of mildew. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing page after page of her father's spidery handwriting. The entries were dated from years before his disappearance, the ink faded but still legible. The first few pages were innocent enough, mundane entries about work, family, and the challenges of raising a young daughter. But as she read on, the tone shifted, becoming darker, more frantic. The handwriting grew erratic, the words slanting wildly across the pages. Emily's breath hitched as she began to absorb the full horror of her father's descent into madness. The journal detailed his encounters with a dark entity that had haunted the Harper family for generations. Her father described the way it whispered to him in the dead of night, promising power and protection in exchange for a terrible price. At first, he had dismissed it as a figment of his imagination, the product of stress and sleepless nights. But as the days turned into weeks, the entity's presence became impossible to ignore. Emily's heart pounded as she flipped through the pages, the horror of her father's experiences bleeding into her own reality. He wrote of the cold spots in the house, the feeling of being watched, and the sinister dreams that plagued him, dreams of a child's laughter echoing through the halls. The same laughter that had begun to haunt Emily's nights. The journal entries grew increasingly disturbing as her father recounted the entity's demands. It wanted a sacrifice, a life in exchange for the Harper family's safety. And then came the revelation that nearly made Emily drop the book in shock. The bones she had unearthed belonged to a child named Samuel, a boy who had lived in the town over a century ago, murdered by her father as part of a dark ritual. Her father believed that sacrificing the boy would protect the family from the entity's wrath, but the ritual had failed. The entity's hunger had only grown stronger, its focus shifting to Emily. Tears welled in her eyes as she read her father's desperate pleas for forgiveness, his fear that the curse would consume them all. The final entries were barely coherent, scribbled in a frenzy of terror. He had known the ritual was wrong, had felt the weight of his sin every day since, but by the time he tried to stop it, it was too late. The entity had claimed Samuel's life, and now it wanted hers. The room around Emily seemed to grow colder with every word she read, the shadows lengthening as if drawn to her fear. The walls themselves felt as if they were closing in, pressing down on her with a malevolent force. The realization that her own father had committed such an atrocity left her both horrified and heartbroken, her image of him shattered beyond repair. But there was no time to mourn. The evil that had plagued her father now had its sights set on her, and the house had become its lair. Emily knew that she had to find a way to break the curse, to end the horror that had haunted her family for generations, or she would be the next to fall victim to the entity's insatiable hunger. Chapter 6. Descent into Madness. Emily's grip on reality had begun to slip. The weight of her father's sins and the malevolent presence in the house closing in on her from all sides. The journal's revelation had driven her to the brink, but it was the entity's relentless torment that shattered the last vestiges of her sanity. The house was no longer just a place of haunting memories. It had become a living nightmare, warping her perception and feeding on her deepest fears. The nights were the worst. Emily would lie in bed, the darkness pressing in around her like a suffocating shroud. Shadows danced on the walls, grotesque and shifting, and the cries of a child echoed through the rooms. Samuel's ghost was no longer a distant whisper. He was a presence that filled every corner of the house, his anguished cries piercing through the silence like a knife. One night, as Emily sat in the dim glow of a single flickering candle, she saw Samuel clearly for the first time. The ghostly figure appeared at the foot of her bed, his eyes hollow and pleading. He reached out to her, his small hand outstretched, but the image flickered and faded as quickly as it had appeared. The vision left her breathless, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and guilt. Samuel's suffering was a mirror to her own torment, a constant reminder of the blood on her hands. Her mind began to fragment, each day blending into the next as she grappled with the hallucinations and the overwhelming sense of impending doom. She started to believe that she was doomed to repeat her father's sins, that the cycle of horror would continue with her. The weight of her father's actions and the entity's relentless pursuit twisted her thoughts, making her question her own sanity. In the midst of her descent into madness, Jack returned. His face was lined with worry as he entered the house, clutching a stack of old documents and books. "Emily, you have to listen to me," he urged, his voice strained with urgency. "I found more about the curse, about what your father did. You can't stay here. It's not safe." Emily's eyes, hollow and unseeing, locked onto his. "I have to stay, Jack. I have to finish what my father started," she said, her voice a whisper of conviction tinged with desperation. "The ritual, it was incomplete. I have to complete it, or I'll be lost, just like him." Jack's face twisted with anguish. "Emily, you don't have to do this. I know it's hard, but you can't sacrifice yourself. We can find another way. We can leave this place and get help." But Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, you don't understand. The entity will never let us leave. I'm the only one who can stop it. If I don't finish the ritual, it will consume me and everyone else." Jack's frustration turned to desperation as he reached for her hand. "Please, Emily, come with me. We can figure this out together. You'll have to face this alone." The sound of the house groaning and the whispers of the entity seemed to echo Jack's words, a haunting reminder of the price Emily might have to pay. But her resolve was ironclad, her decision made. "I'm sorry, Jack. I can't. I have to do this. I have to end it." Jack's eyes filled with tears as he watched her, knowing that he couldn't change her mind. With one last, anguished look, he turned and left the house, the door slamming shut behind him. Emily was alone once more, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a shroud. The entity's presence grew stronger, its whispers louder, as she prepared to face the ultimate test of her courage and her sanity. Chapter 7. Confronting the Darkness. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a ghostly light over the backyard where it all began. Emily stood alone in the cold, her breath forming frosty clouds in the night air. The backyard was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of the town swallowed by an oppressive silence. Shadows stretched across the ground like dark fingers, reaching out to grab her. The grave site, now disturbed, felt like a maw waiting to consume her. With trembling hands, Emily arranged the items she had gathered: the locket, a few remnants of the ritual her father had attempted, and the charred fragments of the journal. She was determined to complete the ritual and put an end to the malevolent force that had haunted her family. Her father's journal had detailed the steps she needed to take, but the act of summoning the entity was daunting. She began the incantation, her voice shaking but resolute. The ground beneath her seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, and the shadows around her twisted and writhed. The temperature dropped further, an icy chill seeping into her bones. Emily's hands shook as she held the locket high, her heart pounding in her chest. As she spoke the final words of the ritual, a deafening silence fell over the yard. Suddenly, the darkness coalesced into a tangible form. A grotesque figure emerged from the shadows. It was neither human nor animal, but a nightmarish blend of both, its face a mask of twisted fury and agony. The entity's eyes glowed with a sickly light, and its voice, a guttural rasp, filled the air with venomous whispers. It was the embodiment of guilt and fear, a creature born from the darkest corners of Emily's mind and her father's sins. "You think you can banish me?" The entity's voice reverberated through the night, causing the ground to tremble. "You are nothing but a vessel for your father's failings. You will become like him, consumed by your own darkness." Emily's heart pounded as the entity's words struck deep, her guilt over her father's actions threatening to overwhelm her. The terror she felt was raw, the fear of becoming like him almost paralyzing. But amidst the chaos and fear, a realization began to crystallize. She had been carrying the weight of her father's sins and her own guilt, and it was this burden that had empowered the entity. The entity lunged at her, its form shifting and writhing with a sickening grace. Emily stumbled back, her mind racing. She knew now that the only way to defeat the entity was to confront her own guilt. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, she dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "I forgive you, Father," she cried out, her voice breaking. "I forgive myself." The act of letting go was like a cleansing flood. As Emily released her guilt and accepted her past, the entity recoiled, its form flickering and distorting. The shadows around her writhed and thrashed, and the cold that had seeped into her bones began to lift. The entity's scream was a discordant wail, a sound of fury and defeat. The dark figure writhed, its power waning with each passing moment. With a final, desperate roar, the entity collapsed into the shadows, disappearing into the night. The oppressive atmosphere of the backyard lifted, leaving Emily alone in the moonlight, exhausted but free. The air was still, the malevolent presence gone. She had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, but the victory had come at a great cost. As dawn approached, Emily stood amidst the remnants of the ritual, her heart heavy but her spirit lighter. The cycle had been broken, but the scars of the past would remain. She had confronted the darkness and survived, but the journey to heal and move forward would be just beginning. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. The first light of dawn began to pierce through the heavy clouds, casting a faint glow over the wreckage of Emily's battle. The backyard, once the site of unspeakable horror, was now eerily quiet. The entity had vanished into the shadows, leaving only the remnants of the ritual and the fading echoes of its sinister whispers. Emily stood among the debris, her body trembling from exhaustion and shock. The house loomed behind her, its dark silhouette stark against the morning sky. Its once imposing presence now seemed fragile, as if the very essence of evil had sapped its strength. The walls, which had witnessed so much suffering, began to crumble. With a resounding groan, the house fell in on itself, collapsing into a pile of rubble. The final act of destruction was both a purging of evil and a burial of the past. Emily watched as the structure that had tormented her was reduced to ruins. She felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The house was gone, but the scars it had left on her were deep and enduring. Her father's sins, the entity's curse, and the pain of her own journey had changed her irrevocably. As the dust settled, she knew that the road to healing would be long and arduous. Determined to leave the town behind, Emily packed what little remained of her belongings. The familiar streets, once filled with memories of her childhood, now seemed alien and oppressive. She could no longer find solace in the places that had once been her home. With a heavy heart, she drove away, leaving the remnants of her old life and the haunted house behind. The road stretched out before her, a symbol of new beginnings. But as she drove, the weight of her past lingered, a silent companion in her journey. She knew that she carried with her the lessons learned from confronting her deepest fears. The town, with all its secrets and shadows, was now a part of her history, but she hoped that a fresh start could help her rebuild her life. Before leaving for good, Emily visited her father's grave, a quiet, overgrown plot on the edge of the town cemetery. The gravestone, weathered and worn, bore a simple inscription, one that now seemed to carry the weight of both guilt and forgiveness. She stood there in silence, her emotions raw but resolute. The past had been confronted, and she had found some measure of peace. As Emily walked away from the grave, a soft breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it a whisper that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. The sound was faint, almost indistinguishable from the sigh of the wind, but it sent a shiver down her spine. The whisper was a reminder that some secrets never truly stay buried, that the shadows of the past might linger in ways she could not yet understand. With a final, lingering glance at the town that had once been her home, Emily drove away, the whispers of the wind a haunting reminder of the darkness she had faced and the uncertainty that lay ahead.